In 1781, a Swiss banker named Jacques Necker did something no one in France had ever done before. He published the royal finances, all of them, in a document anyone could read, buy, and discuss in the streets of Paris. For centuries, the finances of the French crown had been a secret. What the king spent, what the queen bought, what the court consumed, none of it was anyone's business but the king's. Power fed on opacity. The throne survived in part because no one could calculate exactly how rotten the foundation was. Necker changed that. His document, the Compte Rendu, showed for the first time where the money went. The pensions paid to nobles who did nothing. The gifts lavished on Marie Antoinette inner circle. The staggering cost of maintaining Versailles, while the French countryside starved. It sold 100,000 copies in weeks. It was the best-selling document in France since the Bible. Common people who had never read a financial report in their lives were reading this one. Not because they understood accounting, but because it confirmed what they had always suspected. The monarchy was not merely unjust. It was a machine designed to extract from the poor and deliver to the rich. Necker believed he was reforming the system. He believed transparency would force the court to change, to cut expenses, to govern responsibly. He was wrong, not about the numbers, about human nature. 8 years later, the king dismissed him. 3 days after that, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille. This is the story of the man who handed a revolution its first weapon and called it an accounting report. France in the 1770s was the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe, and simultaneously on the edge of financial collapse. The wars of Louis XIV and Louis XV had accumulated debts so vast that servicing them consumed more than half of all royal revenue. The 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, each conflict borrowed more against a future that was arriving faster than anyone at Versailles understood. The tax system was medieval in its injustice. The nobility paid almost nothing. The clergy paid almost nothing. The burden fell almost entirely on the peasantry and the emerging middle class, the very people least able to bear it and most likely to resent it. Every serious financial minister who looked at the books knew the same thing. France was heading toward bankruptcy. The question wasn't whether the system would break. It was when and what would replace it. If you are starting to realize that financial opacity is not just an accounting issue, but a political time bomb, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Necker's story lies at the origin of what we now call government accountability. Jacques Necker was born in 1732 in Genève, the son of a German law professor. Genève in the 18th century was one of the financial capitals of Europe, a Protestant city-state with sophisticated banking traditions and a culture of careful, methodical money management that stood in stark contrast to the extravagance of Versailles. Necker came to Paris in his 20s as a banking clerk. By 40, he had made a fortune speculating in grain and East India Company shares. By his mid-40s, he was one of the richest private citizens in France. A foreigner, a Protestant, a banker, none of which recommended him to the Catholic aristocracy that dominated French court life. But his meteoric rise was not built on ordinary trade alone. In 1763, as the 7 Years' War drew to its final months, Necker made an aggressive, calculated bet. He bought up deeply discounted French debt and East India Company shares, wagering that peace was close and that the markets, still pricing the risk of continued war, hadn't caught up to reality. When the Treaty of Paris was signed and peace confirmed, the assets he'd accumulated rose sharply, and Necker walked away with a fortune. It wasn't insider information. It was something almost as valuable: the nerve to read a situation correctly while everyone else hesitated. Rivals cried foul for years. accusing him of shady dealings. But the most anyone could ever prove was that he played the game of his era better than anyone else. 2 decades later, he would ask all of France to play a different game entirely, not reading hidden signals, but publishing them for everyone to see. Necker's question, the one that destroyed him, is still alive today. Can a government survive telling its people the truth about its finances? Comment what you think. Let's explore what happens when a careful Swiss banker hands a desperate monarchy its most dangerous tool, honesty. Jacques Necker should never have become France's most powerful financial official. He was Swiss. He was Protestant. A serious liability in a kingdom where the Catholic Church was woven into the structure of power at every level. He was a banker, a profession the aristocracy considered beneath them even as they depended on bankers to fund their wars and their pleasures. He had no title, no ancient family, no military record. What he had was a reputation for results. And in 1776, France had run out of ministers who could produce them. Louis XVI had inherited a financial disaster from his grandfather. His first finance minister, Turgot, had tried to reform the tax system and been destroyed by the aristocracy within 2 years. His second, Cluny, had accomplished nothing and conveniently passed away in office. By 1776, the royal treasury was so strained that France was struggling to finance its support for the American Revolution, a war it was funding partly out of spite toward Britain and partly out of genuine strategic interest, but mostly out of borrowed money it didn't have. Necker was appointed Director General of Finances in 1777, not quite a minister, because his religion legally barred him from holding royal office. He was technically an advisor. In practice, he controlled the entire financial apparatus of the French state. To win over a suspicious Catholic court that despised his bourgeois heritage, Necker executed a brilliant display of financial patriotism. He refused to draw a single lever of his official government salary. Instead, he did something far more audacious. He loaned 2 million livres of his personal fortune directly to the royal treasury, effectively buying his way into the crown's institutional trust. It was a high-stakes bet on the empire's survival. His first achievement was significant. He financed France's participation in the American Revolutionary War without raising taxes. He borrowed extensively, cleverly, and at rates that suggested the market still believed in French solvency, which was itself a testament to his reputation, because the underlying numbers did not justify confidence. This borrowing strategy was not reckless. It was calculated on a premise that turned out to be wrong, that the war would end quickly, that the resulting diplomatic advantages would allow France to restructure its debt from a position of strength, and that he would have time to implement the tax reforms necessary to make the system sustainable. The war lasted longer than expected. The diplomatic advantages were real but insufficient, and the tax reforms required the cooperation of the very nobility that benefited most from the existing system, a cooperation that was never coming. By 1781, Necker faced a choice that defines every financial reformer who has ever worked inside a corrupt system. He could continue managing the decline quietly, maintaining the fiction of solvency while the debt grew, buying time with borrowed money and hoping something would change. Or he could show the public exactly what was happening, force the issue, use transparency as a lever that private negotiation had failed to move. He chose transparency, and he chose it knowing, at least in part, what he was releasing. The Compte Rendu au Roi, literally, the account rendered to king, was published in February 1781. It was, on its surface, a financial report, a document of columns and figures, revenues and expenditures, deficits and surpluses. But Necker understood something that modern politicians understand instinctively, and 18th century ministers were only beginning to learn. A financial document is never just about numbers. It is about narrative, about who is shown to be taking and who is shown to be giving. The Compte Rendu was carefully constructed to tell a specific story. On one side, the revenues of the crown, the taxes paid by the people of France, the diligent management of public funds. On the other, the expenditures. And here Necker was precise in a way that was almost theatrical. He listed the pensions paid to nobles for services rendered to crown, positions that often existed on paper alone. He detailed the gifts, the sinecures, the annual payments to members of the court who had simply arranged to be paid for being present at Versailles. He did not editorialize. He did not comment. He simply listed, and the list was devastating. The numbers told France something it had suspected, but never been able to prove. The court was not merely expensive. It was a systematic extraction machine. Money flowed in from the countryside, from peasants who could barely feed their families, and flowed out to nobles who already had more than they could spend. 100,000 copies sold in weeks. In an era before mass printing, before newspapers as we understand them, this was an almost incomprehensible distribution. The Compte Rendu was read in Paris coffee houses, discussed in provincial towns, passed from hand to hand in villages. But here is where Necker's calculation became complicated, and where the historian's eye catches something the reformers' optimism missed. The Compte Rendu was not entirely honest. Necker represented the royal finances as showing a small surplus, roughly 10 million livres in the black. This was at best a creative accounting choice. At worst, it was deliberate misrepresentation. He had excluded from the accounts the enormous extraordinary expenditures of the American War, the massive debt service payments, and several other categories of spending that would have turned his modest surplus into a catastrophic deficit. He had two possible reasons for this. The charitable interpretation. He wanted to demonstrate that ordinary royal finances were manageable, that reform was possible, that the situation was not yet hopeless. The less charitable interpretation. A document showing the real deficit would have collapsed French credit markets overnight, making the reform he was trying to engineer impossible before it began. Both interpretations may be true simultaneously. Necker was a banker. Bankers understand that perception shapes reality, that markets move on what people believe as much as on what is actually true. He may have been managing perception as much as reporting facts. What he miscalculated was which perception he was managing. He thought he was managing the court's perception of reform's urgency. He was actually managing the public's perception of the monarchy's legitimacy. And those were not the same audience. And they did not draw the same conclusions. The Compte Rendu made Necker the most popular man in France and the most hated man at Versailles simultaneously. The public adored him. Here was a minister, a foreigner, no less, who had dared to tell the truth, who had shown the people where their taxes went, who had, in the language of the street, exposed the court. Statues of Necker appeared in Paris. His wife Suzanne hosted one of the most celebrated salons in the city, where Enlightenment philosophers, economists, and reformers gathered to discuss the future of France. His daughter, a young woman who would later become famous as Madame d'Astal, grew up in a household where political ideas were currency and transparency was treated as a moral virtue. The intellectual gravity of a Necker salon was immense, anchored by the brilliance of Suzanne herself. Years earlier, before her marriage, she had been the great, lost love of Edward Gibbon, the legendary British historian who would write the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Denied the marriage by his wealthy father, Gibbon famously wrote, "I sighed as a lover, I obeyed as a son." Yet, in a twist of high society irony, Gibbon later became an intimate friend of the man who married his heartbreak. In the Necker salon, the man documenting the slow death of ancient Rome sat regularly at the table of the man who was inadvertently engineering the collapse of the French monarchy. The court was furious, and the court's fury was not entirely unjust. Necker had done something unprecedented. He had appealed over the head of the king to the public. He had made royal finances a matter of public debate in a system where royal finances were, by definition, the king's private business. He had created an audience, a public that now expected to be informed, that now felt entitled to know, where before there had been only subject expected to obey. This was not reform. This was, from the court's perspective, sedition dressed in accounting language. The aristocracy moved against him immediately. The parliaments, regional courts controlled by the nobility, refused to cooperate with his financial programs. Ministers who owed their positions to noble patronage worked to undermine him. The Queen Marie Antoinette, whose expenditures featured prominently in the public imagination, even if the Compte Rendu had been somewhat discreet about specifics, regarded him with cold hostility. In May 1781, less than 4 months after the publication of the Compte Rendu, Necker resigned, forced out by a court that could not tolerate what he represented. Paris was devastated. The public responded with genuine grief, as if a protector had been taken from them. He was replaced by a succession of ministers who understood their brief clearly: restore the opacity, manage the deficit quietly. By time, they failed. The deficit continued to grow. The debt continued to compound. Between 1781 and 1788, France went through 4 finance ministers, none of whom could solve a problem that had no solution within the existing system. The nobility would not accept meaningful taxation. The clergy would not reform. The court would not reduce its expenditures. And the debt service continued to consume revenues that were needed for everything else. By 1788, France was effectively bankrupt. Louis XVI, out of options, did something his predecessors had avoided for 175 years. He called the States General, the ancient assembly of clergy, nobility, and commoners, to address the financial crisis. In the mind of the public, there was only one man capable of steering France through this moment, the man who had shown them the truth in 1781, the man the court had taken from them. In August 1788, Louis XVI recalled Jacques Necker as Director General of Finances. The crowd in Paris celebrated as if a king had been crowned. They did not understand, could not yet understand, that Necker's return was not a solution. It was the last act. Necker's second term was consumed by a crisis that no financial skill could resolve. The Estates General convened in May 1789. What was supposed to be a managed consultation about tax reform became something else entirely. A confrontation between a system that could not continue and a people who would no longer accept it. The Third Estate, the commoners, representing 97% of France, declared itself a national assembly and refused to be dismissed. Louis XVI vacillated. The court pressed him toward confrontation. The reformers around him, Necker among them, urged compromise, concession, negotiation. The king listened to everyone and committed to nothing. Through June and into early July 1789, Paris moved towards something that had no name yet. Bread prices had reached historic highs after a disastrous harvest. Unemployment in the city was severe. The streets were full of people with nothing to lose and everything to be angry about. Necker understood the danger. He had seen the numbers. He knew that France could not feed its people, could not pay its debts, could not maintain order without a fundamental restructuring of its finances and its politics. He had been saying this in various forms for 12 years, but understanding the danger and having the authority to address it were different things. Necker was an advisor. The king decided, and the king was being advised by people who believed the crisis could be managed by force. On July 11, 1789, Louis XVI dismissed Jacques Necker for the second time. The reasons given were vague. A letter informing him he was no longer needed, asking him to leave France quietly and without attracting attention. Behind the scenes, the court had decided to move against the National Assembly by force. Necker, who opposed this, had to go first. He packed his belongings and left for Brussels that same evening, telling almost no one. The news reached Paris on July 12th. The reaction was immediate and absolute. The journalist Camille Desmoulins, climbed onto a table at the Palais Royal, and delivered a speech that historians would later identify as one of the sparks of the revolution. He held up a green ribbon, Necker's color, and called the people of Paris to arms. Necker had been taken from them. The court was preparing to crush the National Assembly. The moment had come. On July 14, 1789, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille. Necker learned of it in Brussels, traveling quietly towards Switzerland, carrying the letter that had ended his career. He had not been consulted. He had not been warned. He had simply been removed. And the removal had detonated something he had spent 12 years trying to prevent through careful, rational reform. Louis XVI recalled him a second time. Desperate, the Bastille fallen, the revolution begun. Necker returned. He served for another year, trying to manage a crisis that had already passed the point where management was possible. In September 1790, with the revolution consuming everything, he resigned for the final time and retired to his estate on Lake Genevois. He would learn in exile the harsh lesson known to every bondholder in history. When a regime collapses, the men who funded the system are the first left holding the empty bag. He spent the last 14 years of his life writing memoirs, political analyses, defenses of his record. He was trying, with words, to explain what had happened, to separate his intentions from their consequences, to demonstrate that what he had built had not been designed to explode. He passed away in 1804, the same year as Hamilton. The revolution he had inadvertently helped ignite had already consumed the king he had served, the queen whose expenditures he had tallied, and tens of thousands of the people who had once chanted his name. Jacques Necker's legacy is one of the most instructive paradoxes in financial history. He was, by any objective measure, correct about almost everything. France's finances were unsustainable. The tax system was unjust. The court's expenditures were indefensible. The debt would eventually break the system. All of this was true. He said so. He documented it. He published it. And the documentation helped bring down not just the court he was trying to reform, but the entire civilization, the Ancien regime, the monarchy, the nobility, the clergy, the world his family had risen within, in a convulsion of chaos that neither he nor anyone else had fully anticipated. The lesson his story offers is not that transparency is wrong. It is something more complicated and more unsettling. Transparency, deployed in a system that cannot reform itself, does not produce reform. It produces crisis. The Compte Rendu told the people of France something true. What it could not do was give them a path from that truth to a better arrangement that didn't pass through catastrophe. It revealed the wound but provided no medicine. It named the disease but offered no cure that the patient, a monarchy sustained by the consent, however grudging, of those exploited, was capable of accepting. Necker was a reformer in a system that needed a revolution. He tried to give a revolution the tools of reform. The Compte Rendu was those tools, a rational, documented case for change, addressed to rational actors who could choose to act on it. But the audience of the Compte Rendu turned out not to be rational actors deliberating calmly about fiscal policy. It was a hungry, angry, exhausted people looking for a confirmation that their suffering had a cause, a name, an address. Necker gave them the confirmation. He did not intend to give them the address. The revolution found it anyway. There's also the question of what he knew. And when Necker was not naive, he was a banker, a profession that runs on calculation of risk, on the modeling of what happens when this lever is pulled or that pressure applied. He understood systems. He understood that the Compte Rendu would create pressure on the court. He intended it to create pressure. He calculated that the pressure would produce reform. What he failed to calculate, or chose not to, was the possibility that the system would respond to pressure not by reforming, but by breaking. That there was a threshold beyond which the social contract of the Ancien regime could not be renegotiated, but only dissolved. He was intelligent enough to arm the lever. He was not wise enough, or perhaps not willing enough to face the conclusion. to see where it pointed. His daughter, Germaine de Staël, became one of the greatest political writers of the Revolutionary era. She watched what happened to her father: the adulation, the dismissal, the revolution, the exile, and drew her own conclusions. She became a fierce advocate for a constitutional government, for the rule of law, for the kind of stable liberal order that could incorporate transparency without detonation. She understood what her father had not fully grasped. Transparency requires institutions capable of processing it: a free press, an independent judiciary, a parliament with real power, channels through which truth can flow toward reform rather than exploding into revolution. Without those institutions, publishing the truth is not reform, it is demolition. Jacques Necker showed France the bill. He could not have known, or could not fully face, that France would not pay it with reform. It would pay it in ashes and revolution. And the receipt would be the French Revolution, a convulsion that reshaped Europe, inspired Latin America, terrified monarchs from London to St. Petersburg, and planted seeds that are still growing 2 centuries later. Necker did not cause the French Revolution. The Ancien regime caused it, by building a system so unjust that it could not be reformed from within. But he handed that revolution its first document, its first proof, its first answer to the question that revolutions always begin with: who did this to us? He gave them names. He gave them numbers. He gave them, for the first time, the evidence. The rest, the people of France handled themselves. Jacques Necker wanted to save a monarchy by making it honest. He believed that if the king's subjects could see the numbers, the court would have no choice but to reform. That sunlight was the best disinfectant. That truth, calmly presented, would produce change. He was right about the truth. He was wrong about the change. The Compte Rendu did not reform France. It armed it. It gave a revolution its first evidence. It transformed a general sense of injustice into a documented, specific name case, and a documented, specific name case is far more dangerous than a vague and hungry resentment. 3 days after his dismissal, the Bastille fell. Necker spent the rest of his life writing memoirs, trying to explain himself to history. History, as it turned out, had already decided. The series continues. In our next chapter, we leave the chaos of French paper money behind to look at the ultimate anchor of global currency. While Necker failed to manage the illusion of credit, the greatest scientific mind in human history was appointed to protect the integrity of cold, hard metal. He didn't just calculate gravity. He governed the royal mint, tracked down counterfeiters, and accidentally laid the foundation for the global gold standard. His name was Sir Isaac Newton. Jacques Necker showed France the bill. He believed they would pay it with reform. They paid it with revolution. The difference between those two payments is the entire history of the modern world.
If you now see transparency differently, not just as virtue, but as a force that needs a structure to contain it, subscribe to follow the rest of this series. Like this if you had never heard of Jacques Necker, the man whose accounting report helped start the French Revolution. Comment below, was Necker a hero, a fool, or something more complicated than either? Share this with someone who believes that showing people the truth is always enough. Necker would have something to say about that. The architecture of power awaits. See you in the next chapter.